We want to welcome you to this evening. We appreciate you coming out. We know that it is not terribly cool right now, and certainly a Saturday night is not always a prime time to host debates, but for the faithful remnant on both sides, we appreciate you coming out and participating this evening. We're going to, as you know, and I assume you're coming for this, this is not an Amway meeting or a 12-step program, so if you think you're here for that, I apologize. We are here to discuss the question, does God exist? And so we will be looking at that question from two different positions. And so with that, what I'm going to do is quickly just introduce who will be speaking today, who will be debating this evening. The first gentleman that I'll be introducing is Pastor Gene Cook, Jr. He is the founding pastor of Covenant Baptist Church, and he has been a pastor of that church for around 8 years. Gene has also authored a book called The Baptism Cult, which is a critique of the International Church of Christ. He has participated in over 15 formal debates on a variety and host of topics. And he is also the host of The Narrow Mind, which is a weekly webcast which is hosted on Unchained Radio. Gene is also a good friend of mine, and though he's asked me to moderate this evening, he realizes, even in the last moderation, that with that we are trying to be as objective as possible and make sure that there is no quarter given or asked. And the second gentleman that I'll be introducing this evening is Derek Sansone. Is that correct? Sansone. I knew I'd do that. It's Derek Sansone. And Derek is a former Calvinist. I asked him what his position was, and he said he's a former Calvinist. And for those that are here this evening that a majority of you hold to a position of Calvinism, this is going to be a great discussion. I look forward to hearing Derek's position, as I'm sure that you do as well. As you can imagine, Gene Cook Jr.'s position is that of a Christian theist, and Derek, his position is that of an atheist. And so the format this evening is going to be fairly loose. I'll be moderating the debate, but it won't be strict moderation. It'll be primarily just to follow the format. I'm not going to interrupt much, which you're probably very pleased with. The opening statements are going to occur with Derek speaking first, and he will be speaking for 20 minutes, followed by Mr. Cook. Then we're going to be moving into a time of rebuttal for 10 minutes, Derek going first, followed by Mr. Cook. Then there will be cross-examinations, Derek and then Gene, and it will be 15 minutes apiece where Derek has an opportunity to ask Gene questions, and then Gene will have an opportunity to ask Derek questions, my favorite part of the debate. And then we will have my second favorite part, which is questions and answers, questions from the audience, answers given from the speakers. And the way we're going to do this is going to be about 25 or 30-minute period of time. What we're going to ask that you do during that period of time is we're going to rotate between the questions. So we would just ask that, one, that you're polite in your questions, two, that you're asking questions that are not statements. If you're asking a legitimate question, we ask that you frame it in the form of a question, not a statement, that you don't preach on either side, and that you're cordial. We would ask that you are, in fact, cordial. That will be for 25 to 30 minutes. You'll have an opportunity to ask Derek a question, and then you'll have an opportunity to ask Gene a question. Then we will have, lastly, closing arguments, of which Derek will go first for 10 minutes, followed by Gene, who will close for 10 minutes as well. And I look forward to this discussion tonight. This is a great conversation. I appreciate the fact that Derek has come out to a church to have this conversation. And frankly, though we're on opposite sides of the fence, I was a pretty hardcore atheist for a good period of time, and can appreciate his argument and can also appreciate his bravado in even coming to a church facility with many Christian theists and opening it up for question and answer. So we thank him for coming, as well as Mr. Cook. And with that said, Derek, would you be kind enough to begin with your opening statement?
Is this good? I can speak really loud without microphone, so I don't want to blast anybody out of the church. Greetings. I have just three of many reasons for leaving the faith. One is the fall of man. Two is divine judgment. Three is morality in the Bible versus my autonomous morality, which is a little relative, nihilistic, and a little hedonist standard. Now, I can't disprove the existence of God or the existence of the supernatural occurrences with mathematical certainty. But what I will do is show you how reasonable, based on the evidence we have, that the supernatural does not exist. I'm going to assume that many of you here tonight have helped put a puzzle together. When you sat down and chose which piece of the puzzle to pick up, it was because you had chosen to put the puzzle together. And within this task, you must carry out the human mechanics necessary to accomplish the ultimate goal of completing the puzzle. Evidently, you choosing to put the puzzle together was more desirable than the contrary. Why? Only you know. Maybe there was a prize for who finished first. Maybe there was an attractive man or woman that was asking you to contribute and you had to end the date in 2 years. Anyways, you picked up a piece that most resembles the space that it fit in. You weren't free to choose because the puzzle is now the external force that requires you to have to choose. You agreed to contribute now, and you must pick these pieces up. So you are now a passive agent as opposed to an active agent. You didn't initiate the puzzle task. You are just simply participating out of a desire. And this desire to take part came from a prior cause somewhere in your past. And was this exposure escapable? I don't think so. You are determined by a social construct. These parameters or boundaries of possible thoughts came at a forced price, meaning that you were not free from any of them. Now the them are the only tools that you can possibly revert to when choosing something. You don't even have freedom to move within the parameters because your memory governs or dictates what you will imagine when weighing up the potential effects related to all possible potential choices. Based on the evidence I have just within my own life, within the ultimate naturally perceptual boundaries, we are unable to escape the causal chain. This is verifiable without the use of theometaphysics. Determinism or causality just simply is. There is a visual cause and a visual effect that can be observed. The very existence of causality or the idea of being determined by preceding events cannot be denied. It's like denying you exist. Determinism cannot be contradicted by words or physical action because in determinism there is no alternative choice because all choices have a determinate factor or cause. Hence, we are trapped in the causal chain. On to volition. It's an interesting word. I have it as an act of making a choice and the power of choosing or determining, will. Calvinists like Gene use it as they reject free will to support the doctrine of predestination. Gene thinks that the will is in bondage. I think the will is built by external forces of the effects from the causal chain. Calvinists also assume the concept of God's providential hand in their lives, but find a way to squeeze in the word volition. So, one of my big questions here is, who builds the volition? Is the volition free from external forces and influence? If you say yes, then you just defeated yourself because you just answered me. If no, then how was it that you control the amount of influencing forces that ultimately formed your values of objects? Like the following ball example. A ball is a passive spatial object. It has to be picked up and thrown by a human, but is also actively rotating and physically moving. We, like the ball, are active in a reactive sense. So who starts what? I would have to say that the activity that we think we are initiating, this volition that we have, is still a result of determinants in which we did not create or choose. In order to make a decision, there is deliberation. It is a prerequisite for having made a choice. But what is actually happening when we deliberate? It is simple. We're using memory to give us the old observations that we had in our head stored in order to get to the most desirable option available to us. No one could ignore deliberation. We are not freely volitional agents, nor are we able to make choices that have escaped prejudice or preconceived ideas, because the details that surround the situation were forced into our memory bank by our social construct. If the Christian God was the first cause of the causal chain, which is what I used to hold to for a while during my deconversion, all the parameters of existence were consequent of this first cause. He creates existence itself, all the possible types of characters, all the possible choices that we could choose from. There can be no divine judgment if we were unable to choose outside of the only possible parameters that we were forced to live within. My findings, which hold the basis for my non-theist position, are rooted on evidence which render them highly probable. And due to the miserable failure to show probability to the contrary, this is therefore intellectually undeniable, unless you are primitive and parochial by not having enough observations to break these mental constraints. Now, on to the fall of man. This is a big one for me. The concept that man has fallen is very unreasonable to me. After an extensive exegesis of Genesis 1 through 3, I have uncovered some problems. The command would be impossible to obey because they didn't even know what knowledge of good and evil meant. Even if you look at what the serpent says, you have to agree that they could not imagine anything without a mental image bank or the ability to reason based on parts of past observations. What effects did they observe? We don't know. We assume they were created mature, but that would not mean that they were mentally prepared for conflict analyzation. And without observing other external forces, we are without knowledge and understanding. Punishing Adam and Eve with death and separation, by the way, refutes the notion of providence because there's a separation. It would be like lighting your dog on fire in order to teach it that you are its master. Just like a programmed computer, we are also programmed. The only way you can be accused of doing anything is if you have the ability. Without the ability, not to be confused with imagination of ability, but real ability, you can't do anything unless taught by a social construct, which again was not free and not possible unless taught by external force. We can't control external forces, like a plant getting water or sun. Adam and Eve had two separate conscious awarenesses, which would mean that what was desirable to Adam may not have been desirable to Eve at the same time. So as a result, if Adam decides to eat from the big tall tree and Eve decides to eat from the small round tree, who's right? Wouldn't that mean that whoever didn't get to eat from their desired tree was in a temporary state of ungood? They would have eventually butted heads. So, whose good is absolutely perfect before the fall in a so-called paradise without sin or evil affecting them yet? I think it is obvious that Adam and Eve had no true freedom, because freedom is not existent to begin with, and they didn't have any knowledge from a childhood or a social construct. And what the heck could Eve have possibly deliberated with? What tools did she use from her memory? She had no possible references to consider and think over in order to give her an idea of a potential alternative. In other words, she had no contrasts. Her human operations would not have caused such effects to observe anyway. This was a first for her and Adam. They hadn't seen such a persuasion from anything. It's like playing a shell game with a 1-year-old. Adam, like an unknowing child, could not have remotely known how death would affect his life as he knew it. He had never seen death in a human. There is no way that they would have been able to do anything unless God had given them the ability to reason, which of course would mean he underdeveloped their brains on purpose, and therefore the choice they made would not have surprised God, because God foreknew this would take place. Ephesians 1, look this up. And this means that God allowed this so-called sin nature. This is why there could be no divine judgment. Now, on to presupposing God. I know Gene likes this stuff. If I lose faith, it is due to me not believing what I'm told, right? But why do people reject certain information and accept certain information? It is because they are ill-equipped to understand the contrasts or identify fact from fiction, reality from fabrication. You have to use reason based on realistic physical limits, within boundaries set by nature, and not imaginative speculation on what could be instead of what is. Faith, to me, is an ignorant cop-out for those who don't have knowledge. They fill in the gaps with faith in God as an answer to their own legitimate doubts. And I think you all have them. But they commit this ignorant intellectual dishonesty only for so long until more external information closes those gaps, which happened to me. Now, on to morality. If good to you may be bad to me, who is right? What absolute perfect standard can we both measure ourselves up against? If you say God, then you are assuming too much, because you are holding that position based on subjective evidence that the Bible is His perfect word, which is going to end up being circular, and you can't have an objective standard from a God who has no positive identity or attributes. Now, I have been also accused recently of committing circular arguments. But the difference in my circular argument and the Christian circular argument is that I start and end within the physical limits of our universe, meaning I assume only what is humanly possible. For I know with certainty that I can't fly across this church. It is impossible naturally. I know that it is impossible to do. I make the presuppositions about the occurrences of the miracles with the same method of reasoning. But the Christian says our platform for our circular reasoning is the Bible. But this breaks down fast when you probe it from an evidential perspective. My old supposition walking into the faith was allowing for miracles and supernatural events in the Bible and in the world. I used to justify that worldview by appealing to the Bible as confirmation. But I kept going with my studies. I kept increasing in knowledge. I kept reading and ultimately came to the conclusion that this was not reality. And eventually, those old suppositions were replaced with facts. Facts that deflated the faith and rightfully put it where it belonged, on the fantasy bookshelf. So, the circular flips, but mine is more reasonable, simply because we all know that humans are in bondage to the laws and limits of our universe, and we can prove this. However, we can't prove the foundation for the Christian circularities. We can only assume from ignorance. So, which is more reasonable, more logically tenable, more likely and possible? I think mine is, not Gene's, because there's no data outside of the Bible to confirm his worldview. He can hold it, but it is not objective and universally accepted, which breaks it down into a subjective position, not objective position. My morality is in a way hedonistic, because morally, we are seeking pleasure, which in most scenarios comes from the form of not wanting friction or conflict. So there is some egotistic, hedonistic undertones in my personal morality. If I say it is hot out, that means that my senses have registered the temperature and my nerves have signaled it hot. But it may not be hot for you. Nonetheless, it does not matter because your nerves don't physically affect me. But just like hot, good and bad are also relative to my personal understanding and sense. I don't like the words good and bad, but for all practical purposes, we can use them to describe or label things in which we either accept good or reject bad. However, this is not always the case at all times. Like a moral issue of abortion or the death penalty, at one point of your life, you may accept them. Then, years later, you may not. No standard, though, was appealed to. This is a case of moral relativity rooted in our personal feelings and senses. So if you cannot yet show the correct moral standard, then no moral standard could be appealed to. Only a moral standard that appeals to religion. But we know that there are many religious ethical standards, and different ethical standards are correct for different groups of people. And since people act to maximize our own well-being, whether under submission of a religious dogma or not, it still falls into a personal hedonistic relativity. Now, I think moral compromising is evident in human behavior. Very often a person, including myself, will cooperate with another person by making somewhat of a deal with them. This goes back to the greatest desire winning, though. There are other acceptable goods involved with what may seem at first to be an unacceptable position to stay in. Something is keeping you involved despite some details that may not be so desirable. But this is exactly why morals cannot be absolute, because there's no moral action that can be objectively agreed upon and free of prejudice. It is unlikely that any standard would be in accordance with all of our beliefs about right or wrong, because few of us have self-consciously examined the whole spectrum of moral convictions and decisions. It is not unlikely that we are inconsistent in our deciding differently at different times, especially when a decision involves something we have experienced in the past that relates us to that uniquely. It is impossible to provide an objective moral basis from the alleged special revelation in the Bible. We have so many so-called revelations that make matters more difficult. Consider the Book of Mormon, the Quran, the Torah, the New Testament, the ancient Sumerian writings have all been written. All can't be proven false, and they alone show that any one particular claim could be correct. But who is right? How can something objective be argued against? I can't deny that I have two arms, can I? Errors are in reasoning, not in the senses. Senses are only limited, not flawed. They report, they don't dispute. Let's assume that God's will is in the Ten Commandments. I've heard that before. We now have an ethical standard that we can apply to our personal particular situation, right? But how are we to justify the claim that this is the correct criterion? We cannot do so by simply claiming that God revealed these commandments to Moses, because we must justify the claim that God gave them to Moses. What would happen if Moses had returned with such commandments as kill your neighbor's wife, steal thy neighbor's goods, take advantage of your parents? We would probably decide that this was not the will of God, because we know that this is not something that people would accept as pleasurable or desirable, especially if God is all-loving. We do not justify that something is morally acceptable by showing that it expresses God's will, because we can evaluate conflicting claims about God's will only by finding which one is in accordance to what we morally accept. To presuppose a God as creator of moral standards is only an assumption. But for you to force this supposition on me as if it were an objective, veridical, structural basis is question-begging. The only structure you have is within a book. Within the pages of the 66 books of the Bible inlays an explanation of humanity, but by no means is it an objective point of humanity's origin. It's his opinion. We have absolutely no testable experience of the supernatural or miraculous in any of our lives, in any of science, anywhere. It's just an idea that appears solely in theism. This assumption seems unreasonable to me and is more of a presumptuous leap into the supernatural theology. 3 minutes. Gotcha. The appeal to... actually, I'll skip down here. Christians are unable to show and explain to Bible critics or to themselves how an immaterial, non-spatial system acts on a material spatial system. They cannot demonstrate the mechanism for such activity. They must assume supernatural metaphysics without evidence to justify their faith. The intangible evidence has disabled all God or divine creator suppositions as being fact. It is non-cognitive, meaning it is not based on or capable of being reduced to empirical factual knowledge. Not only does it lack reasonable sequence, but violates our existential understanding of physical behavior. A disembodied incorporeal entity has no place in a hypothesis about human material and human physical operations and activities. It is pure speculation on hypothetical meta-concepts and is unreasonable to trust as a law or a mandatory value template. Again, there is no testable or falsifiable data to perform and develop such a supposition or hypothesis. The God hypothesis is also absent to the quality of being actual because a question of fact hinges on evidence, which we have none, besides inner subjective emotion that stems from further speculation and fabrication from this entity in the Bible. Now, I'll close with this real quick because I'm running out of time. Gene said that I wasn't saved in a dialogue that we had. And I agree with Gene. I wasn't because I didn't have the Holy Spirit. But you want to know why? There was no and is no Holy Spirit to begin with. And my submission to this ideology came from a preconceived idea of man that in turn allowed me to accept that I was a sinner and I was sick in need of a Savior. Well, there is no Santa Claus spirit that enters into a child that makes him believe in him. They believe because they are ill-informed. Their reasoning is immature. Matthew 18:3, Jesus says, unless you become children, you will not experience the kingdom of God. And I say that is because we know better as adults and we have to reduce our intellect and reduce our reasoning skills to become like children and believe anyway. Thank you.
Derek, thank you. Mr. Cook.
We ready? Okay. Psalm 14, verse 1 says, "The fool has said in his heart that there is no God." When the Bible says that the fool has said in his heart that there is no God, it's not that God is participating in name-calling. When the Bible says the fool has said in his heart there is no God, basically what God is saying, that it is a foolish thing to deny the existence of God. It's a foolish thing. Imagine for a moment, if you will, a man coming all the way from Texas to argue that there is no such thing as a Santa Claus spirit. I wonder how many of you would have come out tonight. Probably not many of you. It's kind of hard to unpack my argument in 20 minutes. And so I'm going to add his 20 minutes to mine. Because everything that he just said proves that God exists. How do I know that? I'll get into that in the rebuttal. I don't want to spend my opening argument rebutting his argument. But imagine, if you will, a man coming up to you and having a debate over the question of the existence of oxygen. In other words, you're standing face to face with a man and you're having an argument with him and he says that oxygen does not exist. And you tell him, yes, oxygen does exist. In fact, it's vital to the human body. You must breathe oxygen. The cells must be oxygenated in order to be living and to stay alive. And he says, no, there is no such thing as oxygen. all the while he is breathing oxygen to argue that there is no oxygen. You point out to him that you have to breathe in. See, you're breathing in between your sentences, and you're breathing in this oxygen, and that's what's sustaining your life. And he says, no, there is no such thing as oxygen. I give that example, and by the way, I borrowed that example from Greg Bonson and Cornelius Van Til. I give that example to demonstrate this, that in order for the atheist to argue that there is no God, he must borrow the Christian worldview the whole time when arguing that there is no God. Let me kind of break this down. I'm going to be presenting to you a form of argumentation that is called presuppositional apologetics with a transcendental chaser. And so if you're not familiar with presuppositional apologetics, it takes a lot more than 20 minutes to explain it. But I'm going to try to break it down to its most basic form so that you can try to get your arms around the gist of what I'm trying to say. All of us have come here tonight for a reason. We're interested in truth. We have a pursuit of truth. But in order for there to be something that is truth, something that we can actually call truth, there has to be an objective standard by which truth can be measured. Autonomous man is incapable of measuring truth. How can we say that? Because on this side of the fence, he says that it is true that there is no God. On this side, I say it's true that there is a God. But who is right? How are we to determine who is right and who is actually representing the truth, unless we have some form of objective standard? And so to use terms such as truth, such as reason, such as unreasonable, such as good or evil, or these types of terminologies that describe metaphysical laws, is to in fact borrow the Christian worldview. The Bible tells us that all men are made in the image of God. And as a result of being made in the image of God, God has endowed man with certain attributes that he alone shares. One of those attributes is the ability to reason. And so when we come to a debate like this, if there is no God, in fact, I'm going to tell you that the evidence that there is a God is the fact that somebody would come here and is sitting there before you arguing that there is no God. That's my main proof that there is a God. How could that be? Because if we are just what Greg Bonson called biological bags of matter, in other words, if everything is naturalistic, if we live just in a materialistic universe where there is no metaphysical realm, there is no soul in man, there are no metaphysical laws that bind us, then really what we're talking about is just two biological bags of matter. In other words, when I left my house this afternoon, I happened to look in the gutter. And in the gutter, I saw some water and I saw some algae growing. If there is no God, really, we can be compared to two clumps of algae. Because we're just natural in the process of life. We just exist. But the reality is that all of us have been endowed with the ability to reason. In other words, God, our Maker, the Christian God, has wired our minds in such a way that when we come to an event like this, we are expecting to employ the laws of logic. In other words, we're expecting this speaker to speak logical. We are expecting this speaker to speak logical. We are expecting certain evidences to be presented to make a case. And whichever side of the case that has the weight of the evidence would be, theoretically, the side where the truth is at, or at least closest to it. But in order for that assumption to be shared universally by all of us, it means that our minds are wired in a particular way, in such a way that we can't escape it. Our minds have been wired by God, if I can use that terminology, so that we think rationally, so that we think reasonably, so that we're able to put 1 + 1 and arrive at 2, so that we're able to look at a set of arguments for truth and say that's a logical system of argument, or that was totally unreasonable, that's totally unacceptable. And so my first premise is this, that because you are a human being, you have the ability to reason. You have the ability to think logically. There are really two schools of apologetics when it comes to the Christian faith. There's the school that presents evidences, and then there is the school that is presuppositional. I happen to be of the presuppositional school because I believe that man's condition is such that he is in bondage to sin. In other words, his presupposition as an unbeliever is that there is no God. That's his presupposition that he comes into this world in. That's the presupposition that he grows up with. And that's the presupposition that he holds on to when he argues against God. But the presupposition for the Christian is that God, the God of the Bible, is real, and the Bible, in fact, is His Word. So we both have our presuppositions. We need to determine which presupposition fits better with the world in which we live in. In other words, which of our worldviews, we both have different ways of looking at the world in which we live in, which of our worldviews fits with reality? Which one is more reasonable? Which one seems to fit with the way things are? And I'm going to suggest that it's my worldview that does. And the reason for that is because the Christian God becomes the only source, the only foundation for something such as metaphysical laws of logic. That is, laws that all of us are bound by universally. Notice we can't see them, we can't touch them, we can't experience them in our material being. But yet when we talk to people, when we converse, when we argue about things, we all employ them. Doesn't matter where you go in this world. Doesn't matter where you are. If I went all the way to Australia, to the outback, and I saw a man there with 3 goats, and I told them that he actually had only 2 goats, he would say, "No, I have 3 goats." And I would say, "No, you have 2." And he would tell me that I'm being unreasonable because there's 1, 2, 3. Okay, if I told him that his 3 goats were dead, and he says, "No, they are living, they're still standing, they're breathing." And I said, "No, well, they're alive and they're dead." Then he would look at me foolishly. In other words, what are you talking about? They can't both be alive and dead. The reason for that is no matter how educated you are, no matter where you live in this world, you are bound by the laws of logic, and that happens to be the law of non-contradiction. The Christian worldview is the only worldview that allows for the foundation and the source of the laws of logic. Okay, this is my argument. And this is my argument, I suppose, not because I believe that it's going to persuade Derek into becoming a Christian. I could use the Scriptures if I was here to preach the gospel, and I would use the Scriptures because it is in the gospel that is the power of God in His salvation. But what I'm doing here tonight is I want to show you how foolish it is to say that God does not exist. In fact, the God of the Bible. It's a foolish thing because in order to argue against the God of the Bible, you have to use the gifts that He's given you. You have to use, for example, the reasonability, the mind that He's given you. You have to use the laws of logic which emanate from Him in order to say that certain things are unreasonable. I had on my opening statement there, I had 4 or 5 words written down. And I wanted to go first, but I gave Derek the option of going first because I'm going last. But I wanted to go first for the purpose of not appearing to rebut his argument. But I had down these words. One was good, one was evil, one was reasonable, one was unreasonable, and one was logical. And I began putting hash marks every time those words were being used. And I piled up several hash marks for each word. And I bring that to your attention because I want to make you aware that he has to use reason, and he has to use logic, and he has to use terminology such as good and evil, although he says he doesn't like using that terminology. I suppose that's bad terminology. But he has to use these types of words, this type of terminology, in order to argue against the God of the Bible. Now, the reason why I started out my opening statement by saying that he's like a man who is breathing in oxygen, and when all the time arguing that there is no oxygen, is because he must constantly employ reason, he must constantly employ the metaphysical laws of logic in order to even postulate an argument against the existence of God. Now, this becomes key because when we get to the cross-examination portion of our debate tonight, I'm going to be asking Derek, and by the way, I'm going to give him I'm going to tip him off. I'm going to be asking Derek, in an evolutionary worldview where everything has just evolved, and by the way, if you say you're an atheist, you don't have any other option for the origin of man or the origin of this world than evolution. But in an evolutionary worldview where things just evolve, in other words, through a natural process over a long period of time, things just gradually change, and finally you end up with a world in which we live in. In a process like that, where do metaphysical laws come from? That's what I want to know. If you deny the God of Scripture, who made you and who gives us the ability to reason according to His laws, where do the laws of logic come from in a world in which you deny that God exists? See, the very fact that he showed up tonight for the debate is evidence that God exists. How so, Pastor Gene? Because he has to use reason and logic, once again, to argue against God, but he's never in a million years going to be able to tell you where it came from. Never in a million years. Because outside of the Christian worldview, there is no explanation. If you want to talk about Mormonism, or you want to talk about Islam, or you want to talk about Mormonism, or I already said Mormonism, we can do that. We can talk about those things. And I can demonstrate for you how those systems are internally inconsistent. Thereby they disqualify themselves as being the primary source that the Christian Scriptures, that is the revelation of the Christian God, has given us. In other words, the Christian worldview is the only worldview that is not internally inconsistent as these other viewpoints are. In fact, I see my friend out here, Jason Gastrich. He's actually written a Bible called, it's an answer to the Skeptic's Bible. Somebody has taken the Bible and they marked it all up and shown all these contradictions. And he's gone back and he's shown that these really aren't contradictions. The person who marked up this Bible didn't know what they were talking about in the first place, and they haven't applied proper logic or reason in their exegesis. It's that simple. And so these lists of Bible errors, and there are a dime a dozen on the internet, but most of them don't even really take into consideration what the Bible actually teaches. So my position is very simple. My position is that God exists, that this is His Word, and He becomes a precondition. Now, this is another important word. He becomes a precondition for logic and morality. He's a precondition. If you say that He doesn't exist, then out the window goes logic and morality. In other words, I could get up here and say, I agree 100% with everything that Derek said, but Christianity is true. Now, how many people in here would accept that? I don't think anybody would. In fact, you'd all think I was crazy. But if there are no metaphysical laws of logic, then I'm not bound by any type of law of non-contradiction. In fact, if I've evolved, if I simply have, and the product of a natural process over millions and billions of years, maybe my logic has evolved differently than his. So that every time he disagrees with me, he's actually consenting my position. In other words, I get up and I say, the fool has said in my heart, there is no God. He gets up in the rebuttal and he says, that's ridiculous. I reject that. I say, praise God. He agreed with me on that one point. What? That's ridiculous. He comes back and says, well, how can you say praise God? He agreed with me on that one point. Well, because, you see, my logic has evolved differently than yours. You see, every time you disagree with me, you're actually agreeing with me. But that's ridiculous. And that's my whole point. We don't live in a world like that. We live in a world in which we have the ability to hear certain arguments, to hear a major premise, to hear a minor premise, to hear a conclusion, and to determine if sound reasoning and logic has been employed. But these are metaphysical laws. So where do metaphysical laws meet concrete materialism? He asked the question, I'm asking the same question. Well, only the God of the Scriptures can give us the answer to that. Because it's in the Scriptures that we are told that we are made in that God made man in His own image. It's in the Scriptures that God calls man to reason with Him. And I haven't even got to the morality aspect of this. Human autonomous morality ends up with men like Adolf Hitler and men like Saddam Hussein. You say, well, no. I have autonomous morality, and I'm a good person. You see, once again, good is a Christian concept. You have to borrow from my worldview that says that there is something good and there is something evil, and then you have to come down somewhere in the middle. You say, well, I'm autonomous, and that means that I'm self-governing. I decide for myself what is good and what is evil, but I'm no Adolf Hitler. Well, you speak in such a way that what Adolf Hitler did was bad. Well, it was bad. On what basis? If we are all autonomously moral beings, then that means we all individually have the right to determine what's good and what's evil. And you have no right to tell anybody at any time, anywhere, that what they're doing is wrong, because their autonomous morality is just as valid as yours is. But in Christianity, we know better. We know that men like Saddam Hussein and Adolf Hitler are evil. We know that morality is not determined by a consensus of population. If that was true, then there would be a time when slavery in the United States, as it was exercised, was good. Because the consensus, at least of a particular region of our country, determined that that's the way it was going to be, that it was perfectly moral. And if society, by consensus, establishes morality, then we have no leg to stand on in criticizing anybody or any country anywhere at any time. And so you see, the world in which we live in is a world in which we move and we have our being, and we think and reason according to the gifts that the God of Scripture has given us. And that's why the Bible starts out by saying, it is the fool who says that God does not exist, that there is no God. Because all the time that the fool is arguing against the existence of God, he is employing the very gifts, the very attributes that man alone has, because man has been made in God's image.
Thank you, Gene. We're going to be moving into a time of rebuttal. Derek, you'll go first, and you have 10 minutes.
First of all, slavery was good because Jesus condoned it. He didn't speak out against it. You said that Saddam Hussein and Hitler were bad because of this alleged moral anarchy or relativity. But, this moral autonomy also ends up with people like me. And what about the Inquisition and the Crusades? Those are Christian movements. I guess I could suppose that many here know who Shaquille O'Neal is. What if I told you that Shaquille O'Neal jumped from half court and slam dunked the basketball in a basketball game yesterday? You guys didn't see it, but let's just say that I said that happened. You wouldn't suppose that would happen, would you? No, because you know that humans can't jump that far. You know that it is so unlikely and unreasonable to hold that thought as a fact. You'd probably regard it as a lie or some exaggeration. You know that it's ridiculous because we know the laws and limits on man. Let's look at presuppose here for a second. I have a little thing out of the dictionary here. I have presuppose, to suppose beforehand, to require as an antecedent in logic or fact. Suppose, to lay down tentatively as a hypothesis, assumption, or proposal. Tentative, great word, hesitant, uncertain, not fully worked out or developed. Hesitate, to hold back in doubt or indecision, to delay momentarily, pause. Uncertain, untrustworthy, variable, dubious, doubtful. All these words are from the root word, basically, of suppose and presuppose. We all make some assumptions about the world, okay? But before we begin to make any meaningful assertions about it, which is exactly what Gene has done so far with his circularities, for example, we must all presuppose that the world is knowable before we can even know anything about it. We ought to rein in ourselves concerning what we presuppose. Presuppose what is necessary to make sense of the world, but no further. In other words, since presupposing is a flawed way of knowing, we ought to limit ourselves on how much we use it. We suppose something that we have not verified personally by observation or within observations of others that falls within the limits of our natural laws. But when that supposed concept is met with verification, the supposition dies, simply. There's no need to suppose something we know. No need to suppose something that breaks our laws and limits in our physical realm. The problem for presuppositionalists is that to presuppose the existence of something that is the antithesis to all that appears is wrong-headed. To solve all the dilemmas in the universe by simply presupposing a supernatural non-answer answer is one of the worst presuppositions of all, in my opinion. Worse, there's no need to presuppose a supernatural world just to make sense of the natural world. To presuppose the existence of a thing that contradicts everything we know about our own world as the means to know about our world approaches insanity. Gene is using the presuppositional approach. He's arguing from uncertainty, basically. He's saying, unless you can prove with metaphysical certainty that my view is wrong, then it is still right. I have shown that I have a problem with his worldview, and that there is no need for Gene's worldview to make sense of the world. He has no reasonable position for his worldview unless his reasoning is in error, which I would not fault him for, considering I'm a determinist and how we get information in the first place. Remember, we don't choose external forces to observe. They hit us without us doing anything. And that's how we learn, by observation of those effects that we did not cause. He attempts to separate himself, but fails to show the relevant difference in his uses of reason that doesn't apply to all human reason. He naturally provides the principles of reason, but then when it shows how unreasonable his faith is, he dodges his and attempts to undermine those principles, because he's using and reinforcing those principles that he's trying to depose. But there are some holes in his worldview. And these holes are what sustain the reasonable doubt that God does not exist, and that I had no reason to maintain this view. His problem is that he confuses the fact that his view has not been proven metaphysically untrue as a reason why he can continue to hold this view. The simple fact that one's views escape falsification is not a reason to maintain them. We must have reasons for why we hold a view. His view contradicts the causal chain. His view allows for a disembodied being to act on the material world without any proof. And because of this, I can't hold this view reasonably. I do not borrow from his worldview. He actually borrows from mine. And we share the physical world, and then Gene says, let's keep going into hyperspace where my metaphysical assumptions give me answers to my questions concerning the material realm. Then he wants to deposit that ideology onto me and expect my submission to it just because he has. Well, that's great for Gene, but I kept going. I had that same view as well, but I presupposed until I knew facts, and those suppositions died. Presupposing no miracles. It's kind of funny. But Christians presuppose that miracles outside Christianity can't happen. That's more special pleading and double-standardness to me. I don't have to believe in logic because it is self-evident in use. It is a human function that is used to find the safest and most secure area of understanding that surrounds us. We naturally apply logic as we observe what people say to us, and we try to find the truth involved in what they're saying. We try to cut through the baloney. Why do you have to presuppose logic, Gene, when we already know that we use it? You may call it something else, but its fundamental characteristics are utilized regardless of the label. You can call it whatever you want, but we call it logic for our language, but irregardless, we use it. There's no believing involved, no need to hesitate. Because hesitating while deliberating prior to a choice being made, you use logic to analyze what someone is offering you. You use it to find the truth of the matter. It's a natural-born emission that precedes an acceptance or rejection of one's claims. The reason claims may be doubtful is because the laws of logic naturally playing out to justify what someone is saying to you. There is no reason to be uncertain about the methods of logic because they happen without choice. It's like a chain reaction, and I think they're empirically automatic. We are all born atheistic. This is a big deal for me. Then by external force of information reaching us, we learn about religious ideology. It then is combined with other ideologies that exist and are all part of the moral machine. We all affect each other, and we're all affected relatively because we all start from different points on the map. Saying God did it is not a foundation for morality or logic. It's the admission that one doesn't have a foundation at all. So if God created logic, God must be above logic, illogical. The true foundation is not logical at all. Ergo, we cannot make any meaningful claims about God, let alone use God as an axiom in logic, which I think Gene is doing. My position basically with logic is, first of all, I'm not a logic expert. But I was accused of using logic when I was about 6 years old with my dad when he would try to yell at me for something, and I used to frustrate him. But it's a thing that we do without having to appeal to any kind of religious ideology. And I wanted to make a couple of statements here about oxygen. Oxygen blows a trumpet. We can see, we can hear the sounds from it. So, and we can also break oxygen down. Scientifically. There's no evidence for your opinion. I don't have a problem with metaphysics. Also, Gene, it's the theometaphysics that bug me. Neither one of them are verifiable, and that's why there can be no objective truth in something that is so undistinguishable to begin with. That's why you have all the zillions of denominations. You have no proof for the naked assertions because it is based on the Bible's word. Again, the Bible cannot be a foundation for a moral, objective, absolute. And you can't prove the mechanism in which God gave me the gifts that I'm apparently using to argue against Him. I'm done.
Thank you, Derek. Gene, you have 10 minutes.
Okay. At this portion, I'm to refute his opening argument. He said quite a bit, and much of it I wasn't sure exactly where he was going with it. He said that there were three distinct aspects that he had a problem with. If I wrote them down correctly, because I think I missed one of them I was writing. Divine judgment, fall of man, morality. Okay. Divine judgment, he said he had a problem with divine judgment. I'm wondering if he thinks that there is no difference between men like Adolf Hitler when they die and men like himself, as he cited himself as a moral example of somebody who believes in autonomous morality. I'm wondering if that's just the end of it, if it's just when you die, you just cease to exist. When I was listening to the reason why he had a problem with divine judgment, and he seems to have totally missed what Reformed theology teaches. And this is quite common among people who have left Reformed theology or criticized Reformed theology. They don't understand what it teaches. He has a problem with God being sovereign, with God having providence, with God's sovereignty extending to every action that takes place in the universe, and yet man having a volition. I'd like to know what law of logic that contradicts, because that's exactly the case that we see. Man does have volition. He's not a free moral agent because he has fallen in sin with Adam, but he does make decisions, and yet we are told in Scripture that all of these decisions are happening according to God's plan. And so there is no, his explanation of his refutation of divine judgment is because he seems to miss that point. He seems to believe that it's either or. In other words, if God is sovereign and God is planning all things, then God really doesn't have a right to judge anybody. And that's not what the Bible teaches. The Bible teaches that, yes, God is sovereign, but at the same time, man is morally responsible. He says he has a problem with the fall of man, and he says it's extremely unreasonable. Really. But yet when I ask the question, explain to me what unreasonable means, he will say, well, it's self-evident. It's unreasonable. I'm saying that reason and logic and the existence of God is a precondition for the way we live. And he's saying, no, there's no sense in presupposing logic because we already know that we use it. Well, that's what a presupposition is. It's knowing something in advance, or it's believing something in advance. And by the way, I never said that God created logic. Didn't say that. Never would. Because logic is an eternal attribute of God. Logic has always existed, just as God has always existed. He says that the fall of Adam was unreasonable because Eve didn't have... he said he would like to know what tools, quote, Eve could have deliberated with. The same tools that you deliberate with, the Word of God. God said, do not eat. And she ate. God says He's commanding all men everywhere to repent and believe in Jesus Christ, and you're saying no. In fact, you're deliberating with the same means that Eve did when she fell. Human autonomy. You are assuming yourself as the authority of what best suits me at the rejection of God's Word. And that's where the whole problem began. When man assumes human autonomy, he is assuming a position that is not rightfully his because he is to be governed by the Lord of Lords and the King of Kings, none other than the God of this universe, the triune God of Christianity. So there's a great misunderstanding there. He says he has a problem with an objective standard of morality, as we call it in the Bible. Because the Ten Commandments, if I say that the Ten Commandments are my objective standard of morality, then in fact what I'm saying is that they are my subjective standard. Because he doesn't believe them. In other words, he says that something is only objective if everybody believes it. But if somebody rejects it, then it's subjective belief to some, i.e. faith, and it's nothing to others. But I was really fascinated by his statement. He said, what if God would have gave the Ten Commandments to Moses, and two of the commandments were kill your neighbor's wife and be disrespectful to your parents? You see, when the atheist says something like that, he is affirming the truth of God's law contained in the Ten Commandments. In other words, it was assumed on his part that it would be wrong to kill your neighbor's wife and that it would be wrong to be disrespectful to your parents. But why? Why? You see, not only did God give Moses the Ten Commandments and the rest of the law, but God has also told us in Romans chapter 1 and Romans chapter 2 that God has written His moral code upon the hearts of men. And man suppresses the truth continually in unrighteousness. But like a child who's in the pool playing with a ball, who's holding it under the water, they're playing a game, who has the ball? Every once in a while, the ball slips out and pops up out of the water. That's exactly what happened when he said, well, we don't know if the Ten Commandments actually came from God, because what if they would have said, kill your neighbor's wife? Boom, the ball just popped up. He affirms the truth of thou shalt not kill in his statement that it is wrong to kill your neighbor's wife. Once again, he is like a man breathing oxygen, but all the time arguing that there is no such thing as oxygen. Not that oxygen can't be tested. That's not the point of my analogy. The point of my analogy is this. You have to assume Christianity, even though you're rejecting it, in order to argue against it. And we're going to see this over and over again. We've seen it in his opening argument. We've seen it in his rebuttal. And you're definitely going to see it in the cross-examination. Every once in a while, that ball pops up to the surface, and there it is. He has to push it back down. He doesn't realize it yet, but he's going to be more careful with his words because he's realizing that he's making objective moral statements, i.e., it's wrong to kill your neighbor's wife, but he doesn't tell us where these objective standards can be found. In other words, we have a sure word of God. We know that it's wrong to kill your neighbor's wife. We know that it's wrong to steal, to lie. But the reason why we know that is because God has said that. Now this is objective because it's true whether I believe it or not. That's the difference. You see, if I say that it's only true if I believe it, it's true for me but not for you, that's subjective. And I'm telling you, this is true whether you believe it or not. Man will continually sit in judgment of God's Word, but in the end, it will be God's Word that judges man. And you can take that to the bank. He also talks about, he made a statement laws and limits of our own universe. I wrote that down. I thought that was interesting. Laws and limits of our own universe. There is no such thing as a law in an evolutionary world. Where do laws come from? I mean, if you're driving out in the middle of I-15 going to Las Vegas and you see a speeding sign that says speed limit 70 miles an hour, do we not assume that some government put that law in place and somebody came out and put a sign up there and said, don't go over 70? You see, in order for there to be laws, there must be a lawgiver. There must be somebody who gives the laws. But in the evolutionary atheistic worldview, it's just like, well, yeah, there's laws, and yeah, we don't know where they came from, and I couldn't really tell you why you should obey them or why you should reason according to them. They're just the way it is. I mean, we know that logic exists, and we don't know where it comes from, but we all know it's there, right? So why does that have to be brought to bear on this conversation? Once again, that's giving the atheist too much. He's exercising his humanness, which means he is exercising certain attributes that only come from those that are made in the image of God. And he wants to argue against God with those and say that God is somehow unreasonable. He mentions that logic... actually, no, he didn't say that. He said something about accepting things that can be verifiable. Accepting things that can be verified. And I would just be interested to know what verification method did he use to verify the laws of logic? Since they, in fact, are invisible. You can't see them, you can't touch them. But he talks about measuring and verifying particular things in order to establish them as truly existing or truly being. And it seems to me that we have a problem here because he is assuming some metaphysical entity such as the laws of logic all the time, saying that there has to be methods of verification. And the reason why we don't believe that Shaquille O'Neal leapt from the 50-yard line is because the cameras are rolling, and surely it would have been on the news. Now, they didn't have cameras back then when Jesus rose from the dead. But the raising of Jesus from the dead is an historical fact. There were 500 witnesses that witnessed his resurrection. And they were alive, more than that, but 500 were alive at the time that Paul wrote 1 Corinthians. So we have an eyewitness account. But you know what? In the end, Jesus said, they have Moses and they have the prophets. They won't believe if a man rises from the dead. And the reason for that is because atheism is the presupposition of the natural man. And those of you out there that are theologians, Reformed theologians, Calvinism doesn't save you, okay? Just because somebody believes in Calvinism or gives mental assent to Calvinism doesn't mean that they're a Christian. I'll stop with that.
Thank you, Mr. Cook. We are going to be moving into a time of cross-examination. Derek, you're going to have 15 minutes to question Gene, and afterwards, Gene will do the same with Derek. Feel free to start whenever you're ready, Derek.
Well, I don't know if 15 minutes is long enough. I'm sure Gene would agree with me that we could probably go all night. I don't know if I have any specific questions. I just had... I have a question.
Right. Can I have your time then? I'll take you. If you don't have any specific questions, I'll be more than happy to take
No, I have so many. I'm hard to narrow it down. How can God be tested like oxygen?
God can't be tested like oxygen.
He can't?
No.
How do you verify it?
Because oxygen is something that can be measured, and God is not. God is metaphysical.
So where is the justification for holding a foundation that is objective in something that's metaphysical?
Well, we both do that.
I don't have a problem with metaphysics. It's just theometaphysics bug me a little bit.
So what is the question then?
My question is, how can you verify your veridical basis, a veridical basis, with something that has no substance, that has no identity, which of course breaks the first law of logic.
Well, God has an identity.
What is it?
And God in the person of Christ had substance. And God has given us His Word, and so we have a testimony from the God of the Bible.
But aren't you basically assuming that the Bible is His Word?
Yes.
Without proof?
No.
But what's your standard for proof that the Bible is the Word of a God who created everything that we see?
It's a precondition for knowledge.
It's a precondition. And where did you get... I think we're going crazy here. Where did you get the notion that this was a justified precondition? How is... You know what I'm saying? How do you base it on something that is untangible, non-spatial, immaterial, incorporeal, all those wonderful words that describe things that we cannot hold in our hand? How can you show that non-spatial system acted on men, first of all, who allegedly wrote this book by the Holy Spirit? How can you show the mechanism in which that took place?
Well, it's historically verifiable, and I've experienced I've been born again by the Spirit of God, and so it's objectively verifiable in God's own testimony, in the visit to this planet by Jesus Christ, the God-man, and also I've come to know this not only historically through Christ Himself, but also subjectively through the Holy Spirit. So I have both a subjective knowledge and an objective knowledge.
Okay. But see, the problem is that you're basing this all on the Scriptures, because this is not verifiable outside of the Scriptures. There's no data that supports this position or this preconceived idea outside of the Scripture itself. Right?
And why?
I mean, if there is, I'd love to see it, because I'm a willing guy. I'm open-minded.
Well, we have 66 books,
right?
And that's enough for me. So. And it would be enough for you also. In other
words, that objective, though? If it's enough for you, but not enough for the other atheists or other Muslims or people that don't agree with that?
Well, what you're asking for is an additional book, and I'm wondering what the difference between 67 books and 66 books would be.
Well, no, I'm just asking how can you verify that this God of yours had acted on men to write a book? How you can't verify it beyond intersubjective opinion based on what you're going through as an experience by appealing to this for whatever reasons you were at in your life before you were saved. I did the same thing. I thought of life as sinful, and I was this guy that was money driven and all those things. But those were just based on my social construct from being raised as a Christian. So when you're raised as a Christian, you already have these things in your head that you justify. You think, yeah, all right, fine, there's God, there's Jesus, there's metaphysical things, there's spiritual things. And so when you walk into this ideology, it seems to meet you at a good place that's understandable, and you appeal to it. But that's still intersubjective. That's not objective. Like, this pen is objective. We would probably all of us agree this is objectively a pen. No opinion needs to be voiced that we don't need an opinion about this. But see, there's so many opinions about the alleged special revelation that we have, and I'm really having a problem with finding a foundation, an objective foundation for morality, a precondition for logic, all these things that you assume and assert without any kind of foundation or backup or evidence beyond subjective feelings.
Well, I wouldn't say that it's subjective. I did say that there's an objective sense to my belief, that is, historical aspect. The Word of God demonstrates itself to be that, just the Word of God. There are many proofs that I could give. There were prophecies that were made hundreds of years in advance that came.
Do you have any?
That came to fulfillment with exact precision.
Can you reference that?
Sure. Daniel chapter 9, verse 24, speaking of the Messiah. I suppose that's the first one that comes to mind. Daniel chapter 9, you may be familiar with the 70 weeks of Daniel.
Actually, you can read it. You'll probably find it faster than I can. It's been a while since I've been over here. Ezekiel, Daniel.
I've got my son's Bible here.
Here we go. Daniel 9?
Yeah, I mean, there's all kinds. This is just one example here.
Okay.
It says in Daniel chapter 9, verse 24, 70 weeks are decreed about your people and your holy city to finish the transgression and to put an end to sin, and to atone for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up both vision and prophet, and to anoint the most holy place. Know that, therefore, and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and rebuild Jerusalem to the coming of the Anointed One, a Prince, there shall be 7 weeks. For 62 weeks it shall be built, and with squares and moat, and it will be a troubled time. And after 62 weeks, an Anointed One shall be cut off and have nothing. And the people of the Prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. Its end shall come with a flood. And to the end there shall be a war. Desolations are decreed. Let me summarize what Daniel is saying here. That there are 70 weeks that have been decreed. In the Hebrew, 77s, a total of 490 years. And from the time that this decree was made and given to Daniel, 490 years exactly took place. You can follow out the cutting off of the Messiah during the 70th week. You can track the anointing of the Most Holy at the beginning of the 70th week. 3.5 years later, he's cut off in the middle of the week. So that would be one place I would appeal to.
And you're saying that is specific about Jesus?
Oh, yeah.
Well, one, I don't see Jesus' name in here. I also know that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, didn't the Gospels get written 40 to 80 years after the alleged life of Christ? Or after his...
somewhere around that time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Is it then logically possible that someone could have written Jesus' account to fit into some of these alleged prophecies? Is it logically possible? I'm not saying that they did. I'm just saying that is it possible?
Well, you see, the problem with that, no, it's not.
It's not possible?
No, not the way it was recorded.
So you're saying that no one could fabricate that. It's impossible for a man to write down a fabrication to fit the prophecies in the Old Testament.
No, because the people that witnessed those events were alive at the time the things were written. And the very people that had seen Jesus were the ones that were the first Christians. They believed it based on what they had seen and they compared in the Old Testament.
All right. Well, I just don't see anything specific, and I still think that it's logically possible, very likely, that someone could have had a religious agenda. We know that there are a lot of competing Christs, right, back then? Were there?
There were those that claimed to be
competing factions, like the Essenes and those guys?
Yeah, there were people that were making claims, yeah.
Right. So I just find it really hard to believe. I mean, I'm sorry, I just do. I find it hard to believe that these prophecies are so clear-cut.
Well, we know that already.
Well, I'm just explaining this prophecy thing. I've heard Jason make this this argument too. How you doing, Jason? And I've never really been a guy that has gone after the prophecies, but I just don't buy them. Well,
if you're asking me a question about evidence, maybe if you told me what kind of evidence would suffice, then I could give it to you.
You pulled that in our dialogue on the radio, and I think that if something could be shown that would be supernatural and spectacular and extraordinary that I could see that defied our laws of physics or our the way we understand our world, then I'd be amazed. I would just be blown away. Literally, I would be very open to it. I'm a skeptic. I think you're a skeptic. You don't believe that Joseph Smith wrote the Book of Mormon, honestly, do you?
No.
Right, exactly.
Well, I believe he wrote the Book of Mormon, but...
Right, but you wouldn't buy it, his story, as being true. See, it's kind of like the ancient Sumerians, Ur and the Sumer. They had a story about the garden and all that stuff. And I just find it really funny how Christians will slam. And I did this as an apologist as well. I used to debate Mormons for a year, actually, and I used to say the same stuff about Mormons. But as soon as when you probe Moses, you find that they had so many things that predated that make it very hard to believe in that validity as well. But I just really have a real kind of funny problem with Gene's presuming all these foundations, but having such a problem showing the mechanism for how these things came about. Laws of physics and limits, I really don't care about them, really, honestly. I just know that I can't beam myself across the room. I know that we can't all levitate to the top of the roof. You know, I really don't have a problem with describing that as a law. I want to know something here. It's real simple. Even if you can find inconsistencies with my moral relativity, because that's really where it comes down to. I don't care what anybody else's morals are. Hitler did something that I wouldn't do because I know that people want to live. I want to live. Okay, so I wouldn't do it. That's where it all comes down to me and my moral autonomy. Okay, I don't have to subscribe to a moral standard to do that because no moral standard can be justified as a perfect standard. And you can't justify your God or God's moral standards because it's subjective, obviously. My question is, even if you can find these inconsistencies, how does it prove the existence of your God? Even if you can beat me up with my worldview, which you haven't, but I know the pre-supper's approach is to beat me up with my worldview and find inconsistencies and say, I can't account for this and I can't account for that. And one, I'm not an evolutionist, by the way. How is that proof of God in the Bible? Or a God? How can that prove that we were created? How can that prove that I'm arguing against Him? How is it proof? Just because you make me appear a certain way because I can't give these explanations that don't work for you because you think that they're relative, which I'm okay with relativity. Good and bad is relative. It's not universal, just like everything else. It's relative to how you think. Look at abortion. Bible Christians fall on both sides of the abortion debate. Who's right? It's relative to how they think and how they have been raised through a social construct. I just want to know, how does it prove that your God exists? If you can show holes in my worldview. Even if you did, show holes.
Okay. It's a precondition for logic and morality. That's what I said in my opening argument. I'm going to stick with that. In order to dismiss my worldview, it's not just showing holes in yours, but in order to dismiss my worldview, you have to throw out logic and reason and morality at the same time, objectively.
But logic is something that we do when we're born. Logic is something that is just an admission that we use as we interact with people. So how is that proving God exists?
Because
of what Paul
we have
said?
to answer the question, why do we use logic when we're born? We use logic when we're born. Once again, the Christian worldview has an answer because even babies are made in the image of God.
Well, that doesn't show anything besides what some Scripture says. That doesn't give me any kind of explanation.
What was your question?
My question is, how can you prove that your God exists by showing that I have some sort of relative view on logic or the foundations for logic or the axioms of logic or morality and laws of physics? How does that give you any kind of proof of your metaphysical assumptions?
Well, it's not. Let me make something perfectly clear.
I don't see anything tangible.
It's proof because of the argument, the impossibility of the contrary, okay, for a technical term. If you reject my argument and you still, basically my argument comports with reality, it is consistent with the way things are, and until we are offered with another worldview that is consistent with the way things are, then it seems to me that we should take the one that offers an explanation for the way things are.
But isn't that just an opinion? Why is that explanation a universal? Why should we take Moses' word for it? Why should I trust Moses? Because of his explanation of humanity.
Because his explanation of humanity gives us a reasonable explanation for the way things are.
Is it objective?
It's objective.
Okay.
Okay. Okay. Let me begin by asking you, Derek, where do the laws of logic come from?
They're axiomatic. They're based on humans.
They're based on humans.
Humans, axioms that are based on human function.
So, are they subject to change?
I don't see how they could.
Why not? If humans are evolving and they're based on humans as an axiom, why wouldn't they be subject to evolution also?
Well, you might be able to add to them, but I think that the three laws of logic are pretty self-sufficient.
So they're unchangeable. We have three laws at least that you would be willing to admit are unchangeable.
I don't see any purpose for changing them.
And are they binding on all men?
I think they're binding on everything, yeah. I mean, A equals A, that's law of identity. Everybody has to have an identity. You have the law of non-contradiction and the law of excluded middle. I mean, all those are pretty much could be summed up with just one sentence. I mean,
okay. Are they material or are they immaterial?
They're material because they exist in the brain, and the neurons in my brain are physical, and my brain is physical, so they actually are material.
The laws of logic are material.
Yeah, because they're exactly.
Okay, so you don't make a distinction between the laws of logic and your brain? If we open up your brain, will we be able to put the scalpel on the laws of logic?
That's a good question. I don't know about that.
Well, don't think too hard because the answer is no.
I don't know about that.
Okay, because what you're doing is you're not making a distinction between your brain and the laws of logic, which are metaphysical, that your brain is governed by. So, let me ask you this. So then the laws of logic, which are metaphysical, and they are unchangeable, and they are universally binding on all things, do they in any way impose themselves upon man? Who is material?
They are injected by being born. They are just self-existent within the way that we look at things. If I go up to somebody and say that I can't be I'm Derek Sansone, that's the law of identity. That's right away. People get that. It's pretty easy to understand. I can't be Derek Sansone and non-Derek Sansone at the same time. That's pretty easy to understand. And either I'm Derek or I'm not. That's pretty easy to understand. I think that people, when they're born, they learn by sensory input to the brain how we all function as a society and a culture, how humans interact with each other. So human interaction is what provides and makes the laws of logic so self-evident by just the fundamental use of them. I don't care if they're metaphysical or physical or not. Honestly, I don't. I know that I use them. If you want to call them laws of logic, that's fine, but I don't even need to know that to use them.
How do you know they exist? In other words, they're metaphysical, they're unchangeable, they're universally binding on all men. How do you know they exist? Because your axiom is logic. Mine happens to be God, from where logic comes from.
Right.
So I'm asking you the same question you asked me. How do you know they exist?
I use them.
So they're subjective.
Sure.
But yet they're universal.
They're universal in how people act as humans. They're objective by definition because there's no opinion about it. There's no subjectivity to them. People may use them in different forms, or they may not be so logical at times of emotional breakdown. But I don't need to provide to you a spotlight over the laws of logic to show that I use them.
But you want me to provide that over God and show you that He exists? Well,
yeah, because extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
Well, you've got a metaphysical universal that's unchanging and binding all men? That sounds pretty extraordinary.
But you and I both use logic, don't we?
That's right.
Right. But how does that... why do you have to postulate a God? Because we're jumping out of this time and energy.
I just want to know where they come from. You're telling me that
they're axiomatic. They're based on human interaction.
Okay. That's why you have to jump out of them. Because if that was the case, then they would be subject to change. But then you contradict yourself because you say that they're unchangeable.
No, because breathing doesn't change. We still breathe air to
somebody
survive,
that stops
right?
breathing does.
Yeah, but I mean, then they die. But they don't evolve. I mean, people breathe. I mean, it's something that we do. I mean, it's a natural function of the body.
Well,
it's a natural function of the brain to use logic to get through to somebody and what they're saying to you.
I suppose, without going off on a tangent, I could ask you the same questions concerning breathing. Why do we breathe? I'm going to suggest that it's because we're made by God and He's designed us to breathe this way. But getting back to my questions, you said that you don't believe in evolution. Where did man come from?
I don't know.
So you don't know?
No. I'm okay with
that. So
the
laws of logic are conventional, they're axiomatic, they're just the way things are. Couldn't really tell you anything about how I got here or why I'm here. That's your position.
Sure.
Okay. I just want to know. Just trying to figure out.
I just don't believe in God. I just don't have the faith of to have belief in God. That's it. I don't have to know origin to
have you pondered where man comes from?
Sure. I think everybody has.
And
great question.
You don't think that it might be helpful to come up with an explanation before you start arguing against God?
Well, that'd be like arguing against Mickey Mouse. I don't think that he really exists. He's a character. So, I mean, it has nothing to do with the other.
Do you know of any public debates in the United States concerning the existence of Mickey Mouse?
Not that I know of. We could start them.
Well, do you think anybody would come?
Probably not.
Why?
Why? Well, I don't know.
Since you brought up Mickey
they don't
Mouse,
have the desire to.
But why is that different?
Maybe some would.
If believing in God is the equivalent of believing in Mickey Mouse.
Yeah, because you can't prove that he exists, and it's a character in a book. Because the only reason why you know about God is because of what people wrote in this book.
Well, the difference between Mickey Mouse and God is that Mickey Mouse is not a precondition for the use of logic.
Well, that's your assertion, but you can't back it up with any evidence.
Well, until you provide me with some foundation from where logic comes from, other than material universe, you've got a problem because the laws then are subject to change.
I don't have a problem. I don't have to jump into some incorporeal entity's arms to make an explanation of what I see. Because first of all, just because Moses assumes all these things that he sees are evil and sinful, that doesn't mean that there's not another explanation.
See, let me just briefly explain what's going on here. You have two men who have various worldviews. I'm giving a reasonable explanation for the way things are. The reason why logic exists, the reason why morality exists, the reason why we breathe, the reason why babies will begin to use logic as soon as they begin to think and interact with other human beings. Your position seems to me, and the reason why I'm asking this question, I just want to make sure I got it right, is I really don't know. I really don't care. I don't have a problem. It's just, this is where I live.
I don't see anything wrong with that, personally.
And that's
now,
somehow,
that may be personal. That may be a problem for you.
And that somehow is supposed to be an argument to answer the question, does God exist?
Well, see, you're arguing from ignorance from your position, because you're saying that we don't know.
We'll let the audience judge which position is an argument from ignorance.
Your basic theme is that we don't know. We have a pretty good explanation.
I never said I don't know.
Okay. Well, do you know origin?
Yes, I do.
Oh, how is that?
God told me.
Gentlemen, just one moment. Questions are from Gene to Derek. I would do the same for you. Please make sure that that's the case.
Yeah, I know origin because God has told me. So when you say that I'm making an argument from ignorance, can you clarify that? Can you explain to me what you're talking about?
Sure, no problem. Because you don't know objectively, you have a supposition, okay, based on the word of the Bible. But like I said, there's no evidence that supports those extraordinary claims that you assert. And you appeal to those because of whatever reason. I don't care. You can stand on your head and pray to Mother Goose and say this and that. That's fine. But there's no proof of that. And if that's your ideology that you appeal to show you the foundation for origin, that's fine. Just keep it over there because that's not objective. And there's no basis for that.
When you say that there's no evidence, that there's no evidence for the fact that God exists, when I ask you the question, what type of evidence would suffice? You said if God were to do a miracle in your presence, you would believe in God? Is that what you're telling me?
If it was something that defied and broke our physical understanding, our laws of physics, if it was something that was extraordinary or supernatural, it would make me wonder. But that still, folks, doesn't make a connection to the God of the Bible.
Okay, so basically there's no evidence that would suffice.
I don't speculate on hypotheticals, so
well,
that would be something that I have to handle at the time.
You're telling me that I don't have evidence. I'm asking you what type of evidence would you like? I'm further questioning about evidence, and as it turns out, there's really not any evidence that would be good enough.
How about what evidence do you have?
I have
look at that. How about you show me the evidence, and then me look at that as if it was presented to me.
That's what I've been doing all night.
Let's hang out and talk about it.
I've been demonstrating to you, Derek.
But you haven't shown me anything supernatural. You showed me something in a book.
Well,
I could write a book. There's Mithras and Osiris and all these other gods, competing factions of gods. I mean, the ancient Sumerians wrote a book of mythology. They had a story about a garden paradise and sin and God. So why is your book any better?
Okay, well, once again, as David said, I'm asking the questions now.
Sorry.
So you're basically saying, I want to get this straight for the record. There is no evidence that you could be provided with that would persuade you that the Christian God is the true God.
I think you'd have to come down and say, hey, look, I'm the guy that wrote this book. And I would be like, okay, that would make it a little easier. But since you can't demonstrate that, and you can't make any kind of positive claims that any of this stuff that's in my book here,
Derek,
your book,
have you ever heard of Jesus Christ? You've heard of Jesus Christ, right? That's exactly what Jesus Christ did. Now, are you telling me that He would have to come down 365 days a year to every single human being that ever existed and give them that same type of material evidence in order for them to believe?
Well, I think that, yeah, I don't think it's, I don't think that that's such a big deal. I mean, if God loves us and set the parameters and all the conditions for the world. Now, I'm saying if. I'm not saying that God exists. I'm saying if God did this, and if this explanation in the Bible is correct, then why such hiddenness? Why such roadblocks? Why such puzzles within the Bible? Why do we have Reformed Baptists and other Baptists? Why do we have all the different denominations?
Okay.
Because we have to argue over context and language and all these things. It's like,
if God came
show
down,
me something real.
If God came down and showed you something quote unquote real, how would you know it was God? How do you know it wasn't just some demon deceiving you?
I don't know.
So really, there's really nothing that could be given. Even if God came down, you could not know anything for sure.
Well, I mean, it would be pretty hard to argue against God if He came down and basically told me who He was and what His purpose was and verified and backed up what was said in this book. And I could make a connection.
Okay.
I can make it's simple. I can
How
make a connection.
How about this? What if God did come down, but you didn't see Him? But since He's sovereign, He had the ability to persuade your heart and your mind to trust in Him. You think that would be a viable option?
Well, I did that once, and I realized that it was because of my presuppositions going into that where I was met with that ideology, where I was before that appealed to me. But later on, I realized, just like anybody that gets information that increases in knowledge, that supposition died, because that's not the objective explanation of humanity. Like I said in my opening, it's just an explanation from one person. And so there can't be, there naturally is an alternative. And so that alternative is where I sit. I don't have a problem with that.
So you gave, I just want to get this straight. This is the last question, David. You gave up the God of the Bible, Christianity, a logical explanation for the reason and foundation of things like morality and the laws of logic to just say, I don't know? That's your position?
Somewhat, because
Okay.
you look at...
We're done. Thank you.
Well, if you look at Genesis 1 through 3, you realize that Eve did not deliberate the same way I deliberate, because I had a social construct and Eve did not. And if that means that if God had instructed Adam and Eve, that He ill-instructed them. And any kind of deliberation would be based on what they knew through God. And they did not know other humans. Remember that, folks. They did not have any kind of other effects to observe from other humans to know what would affect them and what wouldn't affect them in such ways.
Are we out of time, David? Okay.
Sorry about that.
That's all right. I was going to ask another question if we had more time.
Are we ready, gentlemen?
Right.
By the way, just as an aside, again, before they finish their closing statements, I want to thank both Derek and Gene for coming out. And I find it fascinating, this discussion, namely because I think that there is a great assumption on both sides of this particular debate that there can't be some sort of congenial, cogent, thought-out response to each other's question and position. And I find it interesting that not only can this occur in a situation such as this, which it is in a church, 98% of you probably are Christian, and Derek has chosen to come out and have such discussion. I find it interesting that does not happen often with Christians going into such an environment as the university, the academic arena. sometimes because there's not an allowance for that, but oftentimes because I think we as Christians are afraid to be put in such a situation. I think, Derek, and this is not a pat on your back, I think it's brave for you to come out here and do this. But I also think that this should be normal for us. This shouldn't be an exception to the norm. Frankly, having a formal debate about this issue and leaving it to an event such as this, it's great, and I think it's wonderful to stick to some guidelines. But this is, I think, what we should be doing on both sides of the fence on a fairly continuous basis. I think Derek and Gene would both say that there should be an increase of knowledge. There should be a continuous pursuit of truth, whether that is a truth with a small t or a truth with a capital T. This is something that we should all desire. And I really thank you all for coming out this evening. It's not a huge crowd, and that saddens me. But for those of you that did come out to discuss this, I pray that this gives you some encouragement to then venture off and do the same with those that have made statements that there is no God, that they're not sure about there being a God, and certainly for those that are atheistic, that their Christian friends may not be as interested in debating with them. I hope that this gives you some incentive to engage in that kind of conversation and dialogue. With that said, Derek, if you'll finish with your closing statement, you have 10 minutes, and I'll time you as soon as you begin.
10 minutes. Okay, here we go. Gene said something about science, and I want to say that I agree science does assume the uniformity of nature. And if something has an explanation, though, it has a scientific one, but that is subject to falsification based on further evidence. Christianity dogmatically is entrenched in an absolute claim of truth. It will not allow evidence to falsify it, particularly the presuppositional version that I'm arguing with you guys tonight. If we allow Christian miracles to intrude into our worldview, we then silence science because the empirical testing methods of science and scientific investigation will be required to become mute. I also basically wanted to say that it's almost a argument from confusion how many Christians disagree on many items of belief in baptism, the role of good deeds in salvation versus faith. And I was raised a Catholic, actually, and so I know all about the sacraments and keeping that load up every week. I just don't see that there can be an objective, agreeable foundation in the Scriptures if no one has the clarity to agree with each other. Obviously, it's very indistinguishable and subject to personal interpretation and internal references and exceptions. And I just had trouble finding that I could accept that revelation as an objective revelation from an omnipotent God. I felt like if any message that God wanted to give me, He could do it on the PA system and make sure it was objective and He got it to me in a language that I would understand without having to take a hermeneutics class and having to do gymnastics on interpretations and understanding what an idiom is and metaphors and all those roadblocks and obstacles that all Christians and all theists have. If you look at the sheer multitude of alleged special revelations, everyone can sit there and point to a verse that slam dunks the ball for their theology or their ideology. And what I think is that a lot of times people get their own agendas and their own motives. Why ever they do it, that's irrelevant, but they try to work their ideology into the Bible, and I think that's why you have such a problem finding an objective standard in the Bible that is free from opinion, which automatically makes it a subjective alleged standard, not objective. I had something about Gene not having the ability to clarify and substantiate and verify his suppositions about his God. With Gene's methodology, green leprechauns can exist, pink elephants can exist on Jupiter. We can make all kinds of assertions. If that's the method of trying to prove our assertions, they don't escape anything. the way we would consider taking someone else's claims on such an extraordinary postulation or an assertion. Like I said in my rebuttal about Shaquille O'Neal, even if we didn't have TV cameras and we were watching a game at the basketball court in the park, it's just unreasonable. It's unthinkable to accept as a fact that someone could jump from half court to slam dunk a ball, and it violates our physical limits. Whether you want to call them laws is irrelevant. We have limits. We have identity, and we have limits. And we know that anything that breaks those limits is supernatural and is unreasonable to hold into a fact and accepted as a fantasy. I hold the Bible as literature, as historical narrative, but I also hold it as incomplete historical narrative. The account of the Old Testament where God's wrath is justified by the Jews taking their land back. Well, we don't know what happened with the Canaanites. We don't know who provoked who. We only have basically one side of it. And even if we do have accounts of what the other tribes in the Middle East were doing to the Israelites, we don't have a full scope. We can't throw it out, but we also don't need to hold that as the template for our morals and our foundation as humans. I don't doubt that it was written. I don't doubt that it was old. I don't doubt that these men were intelligent, but I think that they had agendas for whatever reasons they did. That's irrelevant, but I don't accept the Bible as a written document from an omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent God. I accept it as a fantasy, as a ideology. It can meet you where you are in your life and fix many things in your life. It did me. But that was because of my condition when I met the Bible. I already assumed metaphysics. I already assumed theometaphysics. I already assumed that there was a God because of my social construct through my childhood. I already assumed many of the things that allowed my foot to be put in the door easily to the rest of the theological assumptions that I was faced to. That's why it's appealing. It's appealing for many reasons. Everybody's got their own deal. I know that Muslims come out of Islam and become Christians, and I know atheists do the same. But it's all depending on where you are at your life. And I don't go and yank people out of their pews on Sunday. I don't stand in front of churches or parking lots and offend Christians and tell them that they're wrong. I just say that I kept going out of the faith for these reasons. And I accept the Bible as an ideology, not fact, and not the work of God and the work of humans. That's all. Thank you all for coming.
All right, well, we've come to the end of our evening tonight, and I just want to make a few final comments in closing. I hope that what you saw tonight is what we started out with. The Scriptures, as I read in your presence, declare that the fool has said in his heart that there is no God. And once again, it's not that I'm calling Derek a fool. I'm just saying that the approach to reason and the approach to life without God is very foolish. God has made it evident to all men that God exists. Romans chapter 2 says that God has made it evident so much so that, or actually Romans chapter 1, so much so that by looking at creation, the invisible attributes of God are made known to man. In Derek's closing statement, he mentioned, according to the way that I reason, it really makes it allowable for pink elephants and green leprechauns to exist. In other words, he can replace what I'm saying about the God of the Bible with pink elephants and green leprechauns. But I don't recall anywhere a pink elephant or a green leprechaun coming down to this earth to die for the sins of man. I seem to overlook that, or I was not informed that had happened. And so I bring that up because my worldview does not allow a substitution for pink elephants and green leprechauns. In fact, nobody anywhere that I know of is debating the existence of pink elephants and green leprechauns. And the reason for that is because man knows that God exists. Man is made in God's image. Man has the ability to reason. Man has the ability by inductive reasoning to look around and see that all this did not come about by a puff of smoke in the air. In other words, it didn't come about by itself. But there is a master creator, there's a master designer, and man will ultimately suppress that truth and unrighteousness. The Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, "For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world?" You know what the Apostle Paul is saying? That the God of Scripture makes foolish the wisdom of this world. And how does he do that? When the natural man is confronted with the God of Scripture, all he can say is, "I don't know. This is just the way things are. This is how we think. Why do we have to give an explanation? I don't know where we came from. I don't know why the earth is the perfect distance from the sun. I don't know what happens to us when we die. I don't know what kind of evidence would suffice." In fact, I found it interesting in attempting to ask me to offer proof that God exists, he began by saying, "I reject the miraculous." That's my presupposition. I don't allow for the miraculous, is what he said. But then when I'm asking him what kind of proof that he would like, he says, "I'd like God to miraculously blow through the PA system and convince me." Well, which is it? Do you reject the miraculous? Or do you want the miraculous? I mean, if you do not allow for it, then you've just undermined the very evidence that you said you would accept if God was to do that which you accepted. You make universal statements, but yet you really can't know anything universally. You make absolute statements, but according to your worldview, you really can't know anything absolutely. You make moral statements and you say, "Well, it's moral for me, but it's not moral for you." But then you make a moral complaint against God when you say that somehow he is unjust in his word, or the way that he operates is immoral. You see, you can't have it both ways. You can't say that morality is subjective and then accuse the Christian for believing in a God who tricks people because that's immoral. You see, you can't have it both ways. But in a world where God doesn't exist, in a world in which all of us are just biological bags of matter. And now think about that for a minute. If you remove God from the equation here, the Christian God, I'm not arguing for any God, I'm arguing for the triune God of the Scripture. If you remove him, everything is reduced to, our lives are reduced to biological bags of matter. We just exist because we exist. We just live because we live. And I would suggest to you that there is no moral complaint in a world that exists of biological bags of matter, any more than there is a moral complaint in the forest when one tree falls upon another. But yet he carries within him a moral code. Why? Because God has written the law upon his heart. He knows right from wrong because God has written it on his heart. He has the ability to reason because God has endowed him with the attribute of logical thinking and a sound mind. Even though he uses these gifts to argue against the God that gave them to him. He sits in judgment of God's word. He says that this God does not exist. He says it's written by men, but yet appeals to other men to argue against this one. By appealing to science, by appealing to the testimony of other religions, or saying that there are other religions that can be compared to Christianity. that somehow is supposed to be a proof or an evidence that this isn't valid? I don't think so. On the contrary, to say that you have to take a course in hermeneutics to be a Christian is false also. I've never taken a course in hermeneutics, but yet I don't have any doubt that I can properly interpret the Scripture. And the fact that there are many schisms in Christianity is in no way an argument against Christianity. In fact, it confirms Christianity. It confirms Christianity because it verifies that even as Christians, our minds have been affected by the fall. And we cannot think reasonably and logically perfect. Our minds and our ability to think and process information is affected by sin. And so we should expect there to be divisions. In fact, there were divisions listed in the Bible. There were divisions among the apostles. This is the Bible in its own testimony accounts for differences of opinion and divisions. Does that mean that there's not something that can be known objectively true? Not at all. In fact, he spoke in terms of all kinds of things that can be known objectively true. You see, he wants to appeal to logic, to say that my reasoning is circular. But he can't explain where logic comes from. You see, if God is my axiom, which He is, if God is the beginning of all things, you can't go back any further than God. If you go all the way back to God, isn't His Word the greatest testimony? What kind of proof or evidence could I offer that would be of higher value than God's own testimony? Whom God says Himself, He cannot lie. And so the words of Jesus are true. When in Luke chapter 16, in the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, when the man that was suffering torment for the judgment of his sins asked Jesus to send somebody back so that his brothers might not suffer the same end as himself, what did Jesus say? They have Moses, they have the prophets. They won't even believe if somebody raises from the dead. You see, for those of us who are Christians, and especially Reformed Christians, what you've witnessed tonight is a confirmation of what we believe and profess. It's a confirmation that it is folly to argue against God's Word. And it's a confirmation that if a natural man is going to come to faith, God is going to have to persuade his heart. God is going to have to move on him in such a way that he changes his mind about the person of Christ. And my prayer is that he'll do that for Derek. But at the same time, Derek's going to be held responsible. There's a day coming when Derek will stand before the God that he is denying. And he will give an account. And on that day, he won't think of himself as a moral example, I guarantee you. Because the moral standard that he will be judged by is perfection. And those that fall short will be sent to hell. They will be judged unless they have been judged already in the person of Christ. This is the gospel that we preach. This is what we believe. This is what we believe comports with reality. It's not enough for us as Christian thinkers to say, I don't know, or this is just the way it is. But if you reject Christianity, ultimately, that's what you're left with. Thank you.